Hello, this is David Wilcock, and you're listening to another Divine Cosmos audio blog. My website is www.divinecosmos.com, and I'm here with an attorney named Winston Shrout. He's focused in something called admiralty law, which I have heard about through a variety of insiders. Probably the most notable person to teach me about admiralty law has been Jordan Maxwell. A series of dinners that I had with him involving Project Camelot, where we sat down and he went through these mind-bending stories about this whole strange issue of admiralty law. And before that, I had another guy who actually claims to have worked on the Montauk Project, and he also was an expert on this stuff. So why are we going to do a whole show on admiralty law? What would you, as the listener, care about such an arcane subject? Well, here's why it matters. You're probably already aware by now that there is a cabal out there who have effectively seized control of the world's resources. We're talking about 80% of all the money that there is to be made in the world is actually money that is going through this cabal. The way they did this is by creating a systematic plan to confiscate the world's gold and resources and hold it on deposit with what we call the Federal Reserve and its international counterpart, the Bank for International Settlements. This plan seems to have been orchestrated in the late 1700s. Part of it involved Adam Weishaupt and the founding of what's known as the Bavarian Illuminati. It actually was just called the Illuminati, but it was founded in Bavaria, which is now subsumed into Germany. And during that same year, Adam Smith wrote a massive 709-page monster document called The Wealth of Nations. And this book created a criteria for the world leaders to believe that they could not have peace on earth unless they completely got rid of all of their gold holdings. Well, this was a big ruse because what these Federal Reserve guys were able to do is spend the rest of the 1700s and the 1800s consolidating their control over the world's financial supply, over the media, building a massive membership coalition by creating the Freemason organization and pumping up its ranks. We also documented in my epic work, Financial Tyranny, how there was a financial takeover of the British government by the Rothschild family. In fact, Nathan Rothschild was able to trade the British stock. There was a stock called consolidated annuities or consols, and the consols essentially were the stock of the British government itself. And because people didn't know whether Britain had been defeated in a battle with Napoleon that was going to define the outcome of the war, when Nelson Rothschild started to sell all these consoles, everybody thought that the war was lost, and he created a massive financial panic, which led to people just dumping their stock at incredible prices. And right at the very, very last minute of trading, he completely bought up what everybody had sold at pennies on the dollar, and it's estimated that his net wealth increased by something like 4,000 times. And in that one single movement, he was able to effectively buy the control of the British government and its economy. Now, the reason why this is so significant is, as I said, Mayer de Rothschild had 5 children, and he treated this like a multinational corporation. Each of these children went to a different country, and using their insider connections, were effectively able to seize control of these economies. And as it turns out, these same countries and these same economies have become the predominant economic force on Earth. So as we go through the 1800s, they consolidated their control, and there was another revolutionary change in this organization through the consolidation of Italian Freemasonry with a guy named Giuseppe Mazzini and American Freemasonry with a guy named Albert Pike. Mazzini and Pike got together and essentially healed a massive divide that had existed amongst these secret societies. They basically crushed the opposition, got everybody together on the same page, and then drafted up a plan for 3 world wars. World War I was intended to consolidate all the Balkanized republics into the Soviet Union, and it succeeded. And what we now know is that at the tail end of World War I, the plan then involved using the atrocities of World War I to justify these countries secretly pooling their golden resources into this Bank for International Settlements. Now, we can also go back and look to see that what triggered World War I was the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand of Spain, and that assassination appears to have been utterly and completely an inside job. To get the U.S. involved, we have the sinking of the USS Maine, which also appears to have been completely an inside job, all intended to pull the strings behind the scenes and start World War I. Now, I understand as you're listening to this that you might be feeling overwhelmed, you might be feeling anxiety, and it might very well be that in order to feel psychologically comfortable, you have to attack me and feel hatred towards me for saying these things. I want to be clear that I didn't make this. And I also want to be clear that denial is not going to solve this problem. We have to look unerringly at the truth, and we have to see what happened. So what happened is, we have really good intel on this. I wrote a whole book about it on my website, how these people effectively, from the 1700s right up through the 1800s, crafted this plan. And by creating such a massive, horrific event. I mean, World War I, for all intents and purposes, is the most outrageous, negative thing that's ever happened on Earth. That event, everybody was completely exhausted. All these world leaders read The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, and they bought into it. They actually felt like the only way they could avoid another war happening, which would be even worse, is to give up all their gold to these bankers. And they did it. They handed over the gold, and what we're now hearing is that there's a lot more gold that they handed over that was secretly held in Asia than we knew. And that's because apparently Asia has a massive, massive mine of gold in it that's much bigger than any other gold mine in the world, except for another one that's very classified in Australia. So this is going to lead to admiralty law. Bear with me. This is all set up for what we're talking about. The world leaders handed over their gold, and apparently it began with a meeting in 1921. Emperor Hirohito from Japan came over to London, and that's where the plan started to be laid out. The world leaders, this is a documented fact, you can go prove this just by reading the documents on the Bank for International Settlements website. They actually have it right on their website. You can go in and read the charter documents where it says that they took everybody's gold in the world. It became illegal to hold gold. Some of the countries handed it over voluntarily. Those who did not were systematically plundered, and this is what actually leads to World War II and the events leading up to World War II, including a comprehensive purging and invasion of China and their gold supplies and much of Southeast Asia by an operation run by Japan as a proxy state for the Rothschild Empire through what was called the Golden Lily. And Emperor Hirohito was not directly involved in this, but he allowed General Yamashita to basically pursue this goal and go and plunder this gold throughout China and Southeast Asia. That gold was, quote-unquote, put on deposit with the Bank for International Settlements. And what happened was the Federal Reserve, through their 12 member banks here in the United States, issued bonds to the people whose gold was confiscated in proportion to what was taken. The part that so many people are having trouble with is the actual amounts of gold involved in this heist, because it is vast. We're talking about nearly 2.5 million metric tons of gold, which is much, much larger than the established, documented score of there being approximately, you can read it anywhere between 120,000 metric tons to 160,000 metric tons. So we have some guys who are blasting me on the internet about this, saying, oh my God, there's no way that there could be that much gold because everything's been mined and meticulously cataloged. It's like, look, if you want to believe that the government tells you the truth and that there is no man behind the curtain, that's fine. But there are very large gold mines, and China considered this a great national secret, but the Rothschilds did find out about it, and they grabbed up that gold. Whether you like it or not, what we're seeing is extensive photographic documentation of what these bond boxes actually look like. The guy who I have on the air with me now, Winston Shrout, I can hear him champing at the bit wanting to jump into this conversation. So, Winston, how do you factor in on all this? Everything I've said up until now, what's your opinion on all that, and what are we looking at here?
Well, basically, let me go back and correct one thing.
Okay.
First off, I am not an attorney. There are maritime attorneys that do specialize in maritime law. If you wanted to put a label on me, you might call me a non-union lawyer.
Okay.
And that might be close to it. But basically, I'm self-taught, have no degrees in law, haven't gone to no law school or anything like that.
Okay.
So let's, you asked me how what we're doing today factors into this. And so maybe I could just start right there and explain it, because it's, as I understand it, there has been some controversies raised over the concept of using commercial liens to accomplish what we're working with here. Okay,
let me just, hold on. I didn't actually finish the preface, which just is that
okay.
You are representing now, you are a public face for an alliance of 138 nations, many of whom lost their gold to basically what amounts to the G5 and the G7 countries that orchestrated this systematic worldwide gold takeover. They lost their gold. We have photographs of the Federal Reserve bond boxes. They're extensive. We have multiple examples of people trying to steal these Federal Reserve bonds, and the bonds being seized, and in every single case, the media says that it's fraudulent. What's now happened is that these countries in the world have formed an alliance to arrest people in the Federal Reserve. Just like you saw with Occupy Wall Street, they weren't going against the government, they were going against the finance industry. And that's really what we're up against here. So these mass arrests are going to be accomplished through the use of admiralty law. And that's where the meat of the story is. That's why the sizzle is there. That's why it's important to understand admiralty law. Because these people use admiralty law. I know something about it, probably nowhere near as much as you do, Winston. But you can't do this with regular corporate law, because of all the safeguards that they've worked in to protect themselves. And yet, admiralty law is what these so-called Illuminati, or the cabal, that's what they use on the inside. It ties all the way back to marine, people on ships, and the fact that the early Illuminati were the Knight Templars, and the way that they were fighting this battle back in the day was with the spice trade, and all that involved ships and sailing on the ocean. And so they actually created the pirates. The pirate flag with the skull and crossbones is a Knight Templar / Masonic / Illuminati symbol. And they had to dominate the sea. And that's where I think all these laws probably got started. But maybe you know more about this than I do, Winston. So let's dive into this, because I want everybody to remember that the apex of our story here is how we're actually going to bring peace to the world and defeat these guys. So go ahead.
Okay, let me give one short definition that might be helpful. And that is, the word fraud itself. First off, you have to understand that all commerce is actually done in fraud. The reason being that we're dealing with weights and measures. And so what we're doing, we're going out and assigning a number to something that exists in reality. Consequently, it's an abstract of that. It's a fiction, or what we would call a fraud. Now, when we're dealing in commerce, in fraud, that's the method we use unless it injures a real man. Now, if the fraud causes an injury to a man, then we stop the fraud. we correct the injury, we redress the injury, and then we go back to doing fraud because, again, that's the method we have when we're using abstract instead of reality. So that's one. Now there are some definitions and statutes as far as fraud, constructive frauds, implied frauds, and all manner of things that have been brought up. But when we're dealing in commerce, again, because we're dealing with weights and measures, everything operates in a fictional / fraudulent manner, which is okay, as long as it doesn't injure. So we have to make that distinction when we start talking about commerce and so forth. Now let me also give another definition that might be helpful, and that is the difference between the words commerce and trade. Originally, commerce had reference to the king and his business concerns, and trade referred to what the merchants did. Now, over a period of time, historically, basically commerce and trade have been melded together on the basis that the merchants are using the king's currency to do their business, and in consequence of that, then we've melded commerce and trade together. For instance, pretty much everybody in the world is dealing with U.S. dollars or what we call Federal Reserve notes. Mm-hmm. And so commerce and trade have been melded together. But being that as it may, the world of commerce is basically enforced through the Admiralty. Now, again, the Admiralty is the king, belongs to the king. He uses the military to enforce his commerce. But again, since we have melded trade and commerce together, then at this point, the merchants are also using Admiralty to enforce their maritime contracts.
When people hear you saying these things, their first inclination is going to be, well, this guy's just giving us a bunch of BS. So
sure.
Why is it that we can seek this information out? I mean, how do you find this stuff? How do you know that what you're saying is actually true? Because I always try to... Go ahead.
Well, the way we know that it's true is because it works.
Why don't you explain that?
Well, it's like anything else. For instance, a carpenter, he goes into his toolbox and he has many tools in there. And each tool is, will do a specific job. For instance, a hammer will drive nails, but you could also use a pair of pliers to drive a nail. It's just a whole lot slower process. So when we start to talk about what tools shall we use to get the job done, we start talking about commerce and trade and all these kind of things. We start to look in our toolbox to find what kind of tool would best facilitate the operation that we're attempting to do. And so when we get involved in commerce, we've developed a whole toolbox, if I could use that example there. We have a whole toolbox of various things that could be used in a particular situation to accomplish a certain end. And so that's why we've resorted to a commercial lien tool in regards to the 2.5 million metric tons of gold that's in question here. So again, it's just a tool. There's nothing holy or mystical or anything about it. It's just a tool that we use.
Okay, before we get to that, because that is really the meat of our discussion.
Okay.
How do we know that this Admiralty law is even real? Is there any place that the people who are interested could read about it?
Sure.
Okay.
The best place to understand Admiralty and the concepts thereof is the King James Version of the Holy Bible. In particular, if they'll make reference in the book of Genesis to the Garden of Eden story, I think you get a concept for how the admiralty works. One of the first things you have to understand is understand the concepts of bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is in the admiralty. It's not in common law. It's in the admiralty. So if you go back to the Garden of Eden story as an example, whether it's a metaphor, a true story, a real account, is not the question here. But the example that's laid there is with, apparently Adam and Eve got into a situation whereas God had told them that we're going to, if you do this, I'll destroy you. See? And so, but in consequence of their action, he moved them from one jurisdiction into a new jurisdiction. And so technically he moved them out of law and moved them into the admiralty under bankruptcy reorganization so that they would have the opportunity to repent before they died, you see. And so the first instance we have of these kind of processes and thoughts and so forth actually started with the Garden of Eden story.
Are you ascribing significance to the idea that the King James Version was designed by these same cabal to some degree, and that they put that in there to set the precedent for usury and this whole system that they've created?
I wouldn't say that in particular. I think there may be some misunderstandings about King James Version. Certainly it's not the only version, and there's many versions, and there's plenty of apocryphal books and all manner of things out there to glean from. But in particular, King James Version was created to be used in the churches and courts. It was authorized for use in the churches and courts. And so in consequence of that, the translation from the various books and so forth that they had to use at that time, the translation was overseen by a man named Robert Flood. Now, Robert Flood was a contemporary with Sir Francis Bacon and John Dee.
Right.
Now, of course, John Dee being in his lifetime, aside from other things, he was also the Grand Master of the Priory of Zion. Right. Which was a secret society created to protect the Holy Bloodline, as his history shows us. Now, actually, Robert Flood did, in fact, succeed John Dee in that capacity. But during the time when the translation into King James Version, Robert Flood was the man who oversaw the translation, and I suppose that he was responsible for the inclusion of certain books and the exclusion of other books. And so obviously then Robert Flood skewed that version for a particular purpose. Whether that was for evil or for good, I can't say. But we have what we have today. And so to answer your question in regards to the Adam and Eve Garden of Eden story, I don't know what the intent of it was, but certainly we see the pattern that we're using right now in America or in the United States, because certainly as most people should understand, thank you, Mr. Trafficante, the United States is operating a Chapter 11 reorganization.
Yeah, they confiscated the gold and declared bankruptcy and have been in a state of national emergency ever since.
Okay, let me say they re-declared bankruptcy. The first declaration of bankruptcy was the Articles of Confederation. The second declaration was the Constitution for the United States of America. Now, the Chapter 11 that they went into was as a result, as you say, of having taken up the gold so that they can no longer execute contracts, which brought an end to common law. I'm hoping I'm not confusing you here.
And you're saying common law separate from admiralty law?
Of course.
Yeah. I'm just trying to make that
common law is based on use. It's based on history. It's based on the precedents of the particular people. For instance, when the United States was being formulated, the founders decided to use English common law. Now, why did they pick English common law, for instance, over Anglo-Saxon common law? Well, the reason they did, because they were all Englishmen. Now, is English common law preferable to Anglo-Saxon common law? It depends on your point of view. But anyway, that's what they chose as the forum that they would use to settle disputes and to do contracts and business and so forth.
Does common law deal with trade rather than commerce based on your earlier... Okay.
No. Commerce and trade are based on what's known as law merchant law. Now, law merchant law is substantive law. Because of the situations in the 1800s, they formulated what was known as negotiable instruments law to facilitate trade and commerce, and then eventually in the last century, then they formulated the Uniform Commercial Code to basically standardize commerce and resolution disputes all over the planet. But it's not common law. It has nothing to do with common law.
So what I'm hearing you say is that countries make their own laws for their own individual jurisdiction. But yes. there is also an overarching law that is used to regulate commerce and trade between nations.
Absolutely.
And that the most current form of it would be Uniform Commercial Code.
Yes, as it implies, Uniform Commercial Code, you understand that it's a complete fiction. But again, because we're operating in fictional terms when we get involved in commerce, and this.
We lost your audio. Can you hear me, buddy? You totally winked out.
Okay, then.
Okay, there you are. You're back.
Okay. Let me ask
you the question again.
Sure.
So we're talking about Uniform Commercial Code, and we just lost your audio, so I want you to start again with what you were going to tell us.
Well, when you're operating in a fictional world, then you operate with codes. It's not necessary to use Uniform Commercial Code because you can, in fact, enforce your maritime contracts, which are substantive, without the use of a fictional code. But when we start to talk about international commerce and how do we settle disputes or misunderstandings or whatnot, then we have a reference to go to if there's no other existing contract to deal with. See, the Admiralty and Maritime deal with contract, and you can create your own contract, and we have many times. That's why I tell people, many instances, they say, well, we're having this difficulty over here, we're having this difficulty over there. Well, I said, the problem is you haven't tightened up your contracts and you're allowing equity to seep in and cause you the problems. So I tell them, tighten up your contracts. For instance, people generally go out and sign an SS5 form to get a Social Security account and so forth, and the whole thing operates as a SSKV trust. Whereas they're implied as the trustee, and look at all the problems it's caused all the people across America. So I say, go tighten up that situation. Go back, re-indenture your trust, and turn it into an express trust, so it's not being operated as this SSKV. And so, in most of the problems that people across the country are facing, because they're involved in implied adhesion contracts and all manner of things. And so I say, hey, go back into the Admiralty, go back into that jurisdiction, reestablish your contracts, tighten them up, and you won't be having the problems you're having.
Right. So you had mentioned admiralty and maritime law as if those were different things.
They used to be, but at this point here, because again, everybody's using one currency, then both of them have basically melded together. It is possible that you could split them out. In other words, you could go back into maritime if you stopped using, the king's currency. Now that could be possible if in fact, you were dealing with a national currency.
I guess something that we still need to address here is I asked you where people could read more about this so that they know that you're not just making all this up. And all you really said is go read the Bible, which is going to make people very angry.
Why would that make them angry?
Because there's nothing technical in the Bible about any of these laws. It's only sort of like a metaphorical story. I
might disagree with that because it is very technical. An analysis of the Old Testament versus the New Testament certainly would be important to make, because when you get into the New Testament, it does become very technical, especially when you get into the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews was written by someone who understood commerce very well. Perhaps it was Paul. I don't know if or not. But in any event, you see in the book of Hebrews, very technical terms and so forth. And so as a first primer, if I can use that term, the King James Version would be a very good first primer. And again, it was created for a particular purpose, and it was authorized for use. Listen now, it was authorized for use in the churches and the courts. So if people are having problems in court, could they rely upon the concepts, principles, and so forth that are contained in the King James Version? And the answer is yes, if they understood them. Now, first off, let me explain that the free enterprise system, the commercial things that we do all across the planet are inventions of Christianity. Now, I didn't say they were good or bad. I'm just saying they were invented by Christianity. See, we're not involved in the barter system. We're not involved in the system, that was developed by the pagan nations. We're involved in a new system. And again, it was invented as a result of the Europeans promoting Christianity. Now, if you go back through history, there were times back in history when it looked like Europe was going to turn Muslim. There were invasions and things, and except for a few small glitches, that whereas the Christians won, but if it hadn't been for those things that happened historically, we would not be operating with the commercial system that we presently have. So, again, as a first primer to understanding commerce, the concepts, principles, and so forth that are contained in King James Version would be essential. Not that I'm promoting Christianity, please.
Okay. Well, what do you see in the book of Hebrews that you say is significant enough to warrant being a preliminary legal code?
Well, let me give you a brief rundown then, because we see this played out again in our history, certainly since 1933. If you look at the Old Testament, it dealt with execution of law. In other words, in order to discharge the debt, there had to be the shedding of blood, and usually they used a scapegoat or a straw man to accomplish that. Now, that did not mean, of course, that the debt was gone. It means it was discharged into the future.
Wait a minute. I'm trying not to interrupt you because I've had tons of haters say that I interrupt too much, and I guess I get excited. So I'm trying to just let you talk, but then there's other people who are going to get mad because I'm not interrupting you when you say outrageous things.
Outrageous?
Yeah, it's
now.
You're saying that the Old Testament says that if you want to pay your debt, any debt, if you want to discharge your debt, that you have to shed blood, you have to kill something? I don't understand that.
Well, let's make this definition. The word we use in commerce is the word debt. if you go into theology, into Christian theology, the word is sin. So sin and debt, at least to me, are exactly the same word. For instance, you look in the New Testament, some would come to Jesus and say, I need to be forgiven of my sins. And he say, your debts are forgiven.
Oh, you're right. I remember that. Yeah.
If you look at the Lord's Prayer, it says, forgive us this day our debts as we forgive our debtors. Now, that's purely commercial. And so we say these same principles, played out today.
Okay, but let's get back to the bloodshed. I didn't get that.
All right, yeah. Well, the reason I mentioned that is because in the Old Testament concept, it deals with the execution of law. Now, this is very similar to what we've had in our modern times that we call the common law. Common law called for an execution of the contract in order to close the escrow on it. And so the Old Testament and our common law are very similar in the way that they work. So we had to have an execution. Now, if you'll go to the end...
It is a very interesting wording. I mean, everybody who's executed a legal document, you put your signature on that document. And why would they use the word execute? That's a very good question.
Well, when we get down to the 1933 period, as I'm going to bring up here in just a little while, we stopped execution and went into operation, which is altogether a different concept. But I need to lead up to that, and I'm using the King James Version as a comparison so that it's easily seen.
Okay.
Now, the concept of execution stopped with a man that's referred to as John the Baptist. John the Baptist was the last legal administrator of the Levitical law. Now, his blood was shed at the end of that testament. He became the testator, and which demonstrates that the Old Testament is a will and has to be dealt with in probate, which is a little bit different law form than most people are familiar with. However, after the death of John, there was a period of time. I mean, how long it was, 6 months, a year, whatever. But anyway, a new contract was let, if I can use that word, and the testator of the New Testament, the new contract, was a man historically known as Jesus, whose blood was shed at the start of the contract, which demonstrates that the contract is in the form of a trust. So, when you get involved in the New Testament, we're starting to talk about operation of law and not execution. Now, there's many concepts that go along with operation of law as it's outlined in the New Testament that we see again played out in 1933.
Okay.
In 1933, when they gathered up the gold, however they got it, through war, voluntarily, whatever. But when the gold was centralized, then the ability to pay a debt in substance ceased. So it is impossible from 1933, even right through the present, to execute a contract. The only thing a contract can be done with is it can be discharged. Now, it is possible, as we've developed the technology, to do a set-off for close of escrow. But when you start talking about the circumstances after 1933, then you're talking about operation of law, which is a very close parallel to the very same thing that you see in the New Testament. So that's why I was saying that the study of King James Version is very helpful in getting a fix on how things actually work today.
Well, it's interesting when you sign your last will and testament, right? That word always has to be included, testament.
Correct.
And I had never thought about the fact that you have the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Yeah.
So if I'm hearing you correctly again, you're saying that John the Baptist was somehow the trustee for the Old Testament, and
Not
Jesus...
trustee. No, it was a will situation. If anything at all, you know, again, it's representative of what had happened, you know, prior to that time. And so when he shed his blood, or when his blood was shed for him, that was the end. And so the will could be executed by the executor, and the executor, according to our theology, you know, was God. So we had the executor come in under probate and deal with the sins and debts that had been discharged into the future, that was waiting upon a redeemer. You see, any system of debt that does not have a redemption is simply an open contract that runs forever and ever. You can't close contract unless you bring in the concept of redemption. And so for the last number of years, many of us have been involved in what we refer to loosely as commercial redemption. And we have accepted the Redeemer in commerce for close of contract.
Wow.
Close of escrow on contract. Now that, you know, it might take us a week to fully develop that concept and that thought process, but again, we're trying to get to the point where we have some logical explanation for what was done with a commercial lien involving the gold in question.
Okay.
So we're kind of leading up. We're kind of leading up to that.
I'm still, in my mind, hearing screaming voices of people who are going to say, this guy is completely delusional. He's taken the Bible and twisted it into all these crazy things. He's probably against Christianity, and he's trying to make it all out like it's some Illuminati plot. You know, and there's going to be people who are really angry listening to this. And, you know, that's okay, because what we're trying to do is get to the information. But I've heard about this admiralty law for quite some time. I know that when you're in a court that has a gold fringe around the flag, that means that they're operating under this law. But where would someone actually read about all this crazy stuff that you're saying? How would someone actually for themselves, if they want to follow up on this and learn more, and they're interested but they might not understand everything, where can you read about this?
I guess some of the same places I've read about it for about the last 7.5 years. You know, I've been doing public seminars discussing many of these same concepts.
Okay.
And have supplied, you know, multitudes of articles, documents, and all manner of things to help supplement, you know, that learning. Let me just say this: the ability to operate in this manner is actually an art form. It's not a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 situation, although some things are that way. But for the most part, it's an art form. And so you're operating, you're not executing. And so when you understand the concepts, the principles, you know, that apply here, then again, you know, it's more of an art form than it is a strict regiment of how to do. It's not a, you know, how to do admiralty, you know, with 100 steps in it. It's just not there.
Right. But there should at least be some documentation that you can say right now on the air of where somebody can go. Give us a reference, give us a place, give us a website address, something that people.
I don't know of any particular documentation. If they want to have a start at it, just go on the internet and type in law, merchant law. And first off, learn the history of law, merchant law, and see how that goes. If you want to go back and study the history of City of London, if you want to study how the Knights Templars operated with their banking and gold certificates and all those kind of things, then I think those kind of things might be helpful to them. But I don't know of anybody that's compiled a book that would adequately even start to describe the situation, except for King James Version. But again, remember, it's an art form.
But you can go on Google for all intents and purposes, and start to Google things like Uniform Commercial Code, Admiralty Law, etc., and you're going to start finding pieces of this and put it together.
Sure. Yeah.
And I also,
merchant law.
Okay.
The Negotiable Instruments Act, I think it was 1857. You can study that. And then there's a whole body of law called negotiable instruments. Actually, that's one of the first things that I studied. It was actually a college course. And I got it on audio with some paperwork and so forth. So that's the first thing that I studied, actually, was negotiable instruments law. And so having an understanding of that, then I could backtrack into, Negotiable Instruments Act, and back into the concepts of banking, gold certificates, checks, and all those kind of things. So that might be a good, I think there perhaps are, several courses you might find on the internet that you could go back and study negotiable instruments. That's an important thing.
Well, one of the things that keeps popping up in my mind is, and I'm trying to remember the exact reference, but I believe it was in the Congress building. I think it's in the Congress building. One of my top insiders was telling me that if you know what you're doing, you go down into the basement, and there's a door that says boiler room, and that's all it says, and you open up the door and you go inside, and that's an Admiralty Law court. It's a secret court behind the door that says boiler room, which apparently has to do with the boiler being back to steamships and this whole marine weird law, that there's like this other form of law that these guys have been using that the people don't even know about. And so I think this is really one of the keys we got to get to here, is that people think go ahead.
Let me help you out with some of that thought process. First off, you had mentioned the gold fringe flag, which denotes an Admiralty court. But whether or not there's a gold fringe flag in the court, I can guarantee you that all of the courts in this country are all Admiralty courts. The reason being is that, again, this country operates in bankruptcy, which is under the Admiralty jurisdiction. You can't get away from it. And if you look at any court case, except some that I file, if you look at any court case in the courts, you'll see that it's Admiralty procedure, because number one, the defendant that is being sued or complained against is a thing, which demonstrates that it is an in rem proceeding. In other words, a thing is being sued. They're not suing people. They're suing things. Because, again, the defendant will always be in uppercase letters, which under the U.S. Styles Manual, if you want to go read that, that might be interesting. But anyway, under the U.S. Styles Manual, it will tell you that anything that's in all uppercase letters is either a U.S. vessel, a corporation, or a dead person. And if you go out to the cemetery and look at the tombstones, you'll see everything is in all capital letters, just like it is on your birth certificate. So that defendant that is listed on all of your court cases that are filed by attorneys in the courts, it is a suit in rem, which is in Admiralty. That's how it starts. Now, after that start, then the attorneys may try to drag it into equity, which most times they do. But all these courts operate in the Admiralty. There aren't any common law courts in the country. Now you can turn a court into an in-law proceeding if you know how to do that.
Well, I remember also one of my insiders who was really into this stuff telling me that he had signed a marriage certificate, I believe, in the 1970s, and that even at that late state in the game, if you actually read the legalese on the marriage certificate, it says, I hereby pledge, or it says, we hereby pledge the issue of our marriage as serf and servant of the state.
Absolutely.
And the issue of our marriage means your children.
Absolutely.
And you signed that contract.
They refer to the operation in a marriage as sexual commerce.
Oh, wow.
When you want a benefit from the state, you go and sign an application for that benefit. Now, as a result of signing the application, the state may grant you a license. A license, if you look at the definition of it, license is defined as permission from the state to do something that is otherwise illegal, immoral, or unlawful. So, when you go and sign the application for the marriage, the state may, and usually do, issue a marriage license, which allows you to engage in sexual commerce under the probation of the state. And the issue that comes from the sexual commerce is, in fact, the property of the state. But there's some things you can do with those situations.
Such as?
Well, what we've been doing, we've done several things, with those situations so that the parents could have more control over the outcome of the upbringing of their children and so forth. Many people, for instance, have used the UCC-1 financing statements and list the children on there as secured collateral and so forth. One of the other things that, that has been done is we've gone back and claimed the birth certificate and used it again in commerce as collateral, perhaps for a lien or other things such as that. But for the most part, if people are careful, they won't run into problems and won't need to do those kind of things. But for those from time to time, they run into situations, especially when they get involved in divorce courts and all kind of things, then perhaps the outcome of the issue, it might be something that has to be dealt with. And so we have developed technologies that are helpful to parents dealing with some of those kind of situations. For instance, I'll give you a perfect example of this. One of my friends up in Canada, a native man up there, he had developed technology to liberate children from the government schools. If you studied the situation up there, you know how desperate the children are in those government schools. So he had developed certain technologies and so forth where he could actually go and liberate the children away from the government schools and return them to their families. And so we've used these technologies in various places, for different situations. But again, it's all, if you understand the correct procedures and things and so forth in commerce, how the thing works, again, look in your toolbox, see which tool you need to accomplish a certain job, and go out and use it.
Okay.
And I really don't think that people that listen to this are going to be offended by it. They might question it because it might be new to them, but I don't think between the conversation you and I have had that we've said anything that should offend anybody. The proof in what we're talking about is in the successful application of what we're talking about.
Right. And the anger that people have to some degree is just out of a feeling of vulnerability.
They're angry at themselves. They're not angry at you or I. They're angry at themselves. You know that.
Well, what you're telling me is that all of the things that we're talking about are actually hidden in the legalese. Not
in legalese. No. Yeah, you have to understand that law merchant, as I mentioned, law merchant law is substantive law. It deals with real things. And so we're not talking about legalese here. We're talking about reality. And so when we start to, creating paperwork and getting into court and talking all those kind of things, it's all basically gibberish. But the reality is the results of what we do. And like I say, you can't argue with a guy that can liberate 300 children away from the government. Now, legalese or whatever it is that he used to get there is one thing. But again, the proof of what he was doing was the return of the children to their families. And so, we're not talking about fictions here and all this kind of thing in so much as we use fictions to accomplish a certain goal. Now let's talk about, for instance, people want to get into business. They want to operate a store. They want to operate a farm. They want to run a construction business and all these kind of things. Would these elements that we're bringing up here be of a benefit to them in those endeavors? And the answer is yes, very much so.
Okay. How would that happen?
Well, for instance, let's say you want to be a contractor and you want to go out here and build houses and so forth. And so in order to get insurance to be a contractor, you have to have a license and all those kind of things. So, there's nothing particularly intrinsically bad about that, but it's how you use that license, it's how you deal with the insurance, it's how you deal with construction bonds and so forth that would show you either a profit or a loss. For instance, I'll give you a perfect example of this. Now, this might sound a little far-flung, but one of the individuals that I've worked with over the years is, in fact, an electrical contractor. And he had a successful business, and he had built his business up to the point that he could go out and bid on, perhaps up to like a $2 million job. And so he was very successful at it. And so on occasion, for whatever reason, I'm not sure, he got into a squabble with one of the major banks about something. I'm not sure what it was. But anyway, he went through an administrative process, and then he went and did the commercial lien process, perfected the commercial lien, and certainly after 90 days, the commercial lien turned into a security. Now, he asked me, what can I do with this? I said, go ask your CPA if, in fact, they can take that security and lodge it as an asset in your business. So he went to his CPA, a lady. She had about like 30 years experience. He said, can you lodge in this commercial lien into my business? She said, yes, it'll take me about 2 days to get it in there. So she went to work, and sure enough, 2 or 3 days later, his commercial lien showed up as an asset to his business. Now, the commercial lien was for $9 billion. So now all of a sudden, his business, instead of having, assets that look like $2 million, now he has a business with assets that look like $9 billion. Now, what kind of job do you think he can bid on with a $9 billion asset?
Anything he wants.
Most anything he wants. You see, this is actually how it works. So people say, well, how can these things be beneficial? Well, there's a perfect example of it.
Bring in another subject, because there's a lot of stuff that Jordan Maxwell would be saying if he was here, and I'm probably going to get this all wrong, and you're going to have a very long-winded explanation of how wrong I am, but
okay.
That's okay.
Sure.
This is all going to be transcribed, so people will probably be able to make a lot more sense out of this when they read it as opposed to listening to it.
Very good.
One of the things that Jordan has said is, and I've heard this from others as well, that when you are born, you become, and I probably am going to get the wording all wrong, you become collateral for the government, and they issue money secretly against your birth. You have these accounts. I've heard that one source, more than one source actually very credible, has told me there's 10 different accounts. And that when you get your Social Security card, you can turn it around on the back, and you'll see this red number there that's called your stock number. And it turns out you have 10 of these, and each one of them is worth millions of dollars. It's an account that's then packaged into a mutual fund when you're born, and it's an account held in your name, and technically you do own these accounts, and technically money is issued against these accounts in Federal Reserve notes, so that when you look at $1 or a $20 bill or a $100 bill, you see this number on it, And we've been led to believe that each bill has a separate serial number, when in fact, according to what I've heard, there are tons of bills out there that have the same numbers, because each of those numbers that you see represents someone's account. And so when they're stealing money, there's an occult system involved in which the stealing of the money is the stealing of people's body that stock has been issued against. So I'm interested if you have heard anything about this. And
Oh, yes.
okay.
Well, let me explain some of that. And first off, the word occult itself is not a voodoo word. All it means is something that's hidden.
Right.
So it's not a voodoo word. It's just a description of something that perhaps you don't know about today, but you could learn about tomorrow.
Okay.
So going back, this all has to do with the concept of original issue. It also has to do with the concept of exemption. So let me explain briefly what's this process here. And it goes back, believe it or not, into the 1400s with the creation of 3 Sestake V Trust by the Vatican, and which developed into Commonwealth concept and certainly played itself well into the feudal system, which we operate under today. But again, when a child is born, whether it's a result of a marriage license or not, is of no particular consequence. The question is whether or not that child is registered, which creates an exemption. Now, let me just briefly divert back to the New Testament. Why did Joseph and Mary go back to the city of their nativity? And so when the child Jesus was born, he was registered, which created the exemption from taxation, as he later referred to when he asked one of the apostles asked him a question about tax. He said, "Well, so who do you tax? The children or the foreigners?" Now, so again, I hate to go back to the New Testament again, but there's so much there. But let's talk about in our modern time, 2,000 years later. All right, so when a child is born, it's considered to be original issue. And so people need to go study that word to see what it means and so forth. But when that original issue is registered in the commercial registry, that creates an exemption from taxation. Now, when a child is born in a hospital or otherwise, well, let's say they are born in a hospital, and that is, there is an application that is made for a live birth. Application for a live birth. Now, how do you spell that word birth?
B-I-R, yeah.
Yeah, most people spell it B-I-R-T-H. Why don't you spell it B-E-R-T-H?
Like a ship's birth.
Yeah, a little play on words there, but that's what it is. All right, so we have an application for a safe port, for the baby. It needs to be maintained as being safe, and so we make an application for a birth, and in consequence of that, the registration of that birth creates the exemption from taxation. Now, as proof of that exemption, all you have to do is go to probate any day of the week to some party who has died and left a will, and certain amounts of their property is exempt taxation. For instance, my brother died 2.5 years ago, and his exemption was worth $750,000, although his estate came nowhere close to that. In today's world, most of the children who are born probably have an exemption that's valued at somewhere around $2 million. Now, I'm going to get back to this exemption here in a minute, because this is an important concept. All right, so the application for live birth is created. It's usually registered in the county. Certain documents are created from that point, which go to the Department of Commerce. Those documents from the Department of Commerce go to the Depository Trust Company in New York. And based upon those documents, then the Depository Trust Company creates 10 bonds valued at $3.5 billion per bond. Now, it's based on those bonds the currency is created. And if you'll look on what you're calling your Social Security card, on the back there is, in fact, a number. Now, that number on there will indicate to you which Federal Reserve Bank is holding your exemption. Now, there's many ways to deal with that exemption before you die. And so as part of our commercial redemption process, we have shown people how to deal with that exemption before you die. And we've been using it successfully for a very long time.
How do you find out which Federal Reserve Bank is holding your stock?
It'll have a letter in front of the number. Like, for instance, it'll be E or D. And if you go look at the list of 12 Federal Reserve banks, the letter will refer to whichever one of those that is. See, I think A is, I don't know if it's New York or, anyway, it'll be, New York, Atlanta,
Right, I've seen the codes.
Yeah.
So there's a letter that is the code of the bank.
Yes, and that tells you which Federal Reserve Bank is holding and using your exemption.
Okay, now you also said something that really was a big thing, and again, I'm trying not to interrupt you here, but this one really jumped out. You said that, to your understanding, there are 10 accounts issued, each of which
10
is
bonds.
10 bonds issued, each of which is worth $3.5 billion with a B.
Correct.
So that would mean that each person upon birth at present time is creating $35 billion in bonds for the Federal Reserve.
No, it's the DTC that's creating the bonds. These things don't belong to us. It's created for our benefit, but they do not belong to us. They belong to the party that created the bond.
What's the DTC?
Depository Trust Company, 55 Water Street, New York, New York. Now, DTC it works under the DTCC, which is the Depository Trust Company Corporation or something like that. But key to the DTC is to understand they have a holding company called CETA, which is an acronym, CEDE, and it is actually CETA that holds the original documents as a holding company. But again, people get all upset about this and say they're doing all these kind of things. But look around, folks. Look up and down the street. Look in your cities. Look at all the things that we have. And why are we complaining about this system that we have? The only complaint that I personally ever have about this is that if some government official or some agent official does it wrong, if they screw things up, then I got a complaint. But the system itself works very, very well. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it. See, this is one of the misconceptions. Everybody's under the impression that all these things have happened by evil-minded people, intent upon our destruction and so forth. But I don't find that to be the case, not at all, especially as I've been involved in the international for some time with some of these other folks you've been talking to, Keith, Neil, and all these people, and a long time before that. But I have noticed that people at very high levels are very concerned about the welfare of the planet and the people that are here. And people in the United States, get the idea that everybody's against us. But it's not true. And the system we have works very, very well. It's just when you get one corrupt individual or you get a cabal in there who are ruining the system that we have a problem. But the system itself, which is a very close parallel to the system that was laid out in the New Testament, works very well. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
I don't know how to respond to that. I don't know if I can agree with what you're saying. I think that, from my understanding, if you are issuing bonds against a person's body when they're born and you're printing money based on that, it's an occult. It's a, hello? Okay. We lost you. Yeah, we're back.
Okay.
Jordan Maxwell seems to be pretty specific on the idea that this was designed as sort of black magic on a worldwide scale.
Well, I would disagree with that.
Okay. Why is it?
I don't see this. I don't see the black magic. I see it as a practical way to solve a problem for 6 billion people.
What problem?
Feed, clothes, housing, all these kind of things. Like I say, look up and down the street. We got these houses, we got hospitals, we got roads, we got all kind of facilities, we got fire departments and all manner of things that would not exist if we had not had the system in operation as we have it now. I don't look at the founders of this system as being evil intended people. I look at them with people who has, let's say, they have a situation. They're called upon as civil servants or whatever you want to call them to say, how do we fix it? How do we provide all these things for the situation that we have? I don't see any black magic in that.
Well, I understand the basis of what you're saying, and I am trying to drill down into the idea that we as bodies and as living people are being used as collateral, and these bonds are being created in which we become the equity. And
no, our labor becomes the equity, not our body.
Okay.
Now this is a very good thing, again, because, for those naysayers who are so disgruntled with the system as we have it, go back and be a pagan. Live under their system and see how you like that. Because you'll be riding around on a donkey with a pull cart. We could not have made the advancements that we have now using any other system than the one that we have. I find no fault with that.
Why is there so much secrecy around it then?
Probably for lack of information for the people. You have to understand that in Admiralty, everything is adversarial. It's like a football game. You got the coach and his team on one side and the coach and his team on the other side. And so they put a team out on the field, offense and defense. And does the coach, for the offensive team send a message in to their defense that, hey, we're fixing to run a pass play? No, they don't do that. It'd be crazy. So the whole Admiralty system is adversarial in that nature, in as much as if you want to know what's going on out here, then you have to go and seek it out. I mean, I was completely as confused about this whole thing as anybody else was until I started to research and look at things, in their proper light and everything. And at first I was angry about it. I thought, well, how in the world could they do such a thing to me? But then after a while, when I started to look at it and see what the alternative was, a donkey cart, and a donkey, I thought, well, maybe there's something to this. And so the more I looked into it, the more I tried to be empathetic, to the situation, then I started to say, well, yeah, this makes sense. If given the opportunity, maybe this is how I would have solved this problem, or this is how I would set things up, to facilitate, the situation. And so we need to stop casting stones and calling everything voodoo and whatnot. Look around. Look at what we have. We got concrete. We got pavement. We got parks. We have interstate highways. We have ships, airplanes. My goodness gracious. I mean, people need to stop complaining and start looking at what we do have. Be thankful for what you have instead of complaining about it. That makes sense to me.
Well, if you're appreciative of the way that this was designed, then why are we doing an interview where we're talking about filing liens against the Federal Reserve and against European central banks?
Because again, we have a problem. The Federal Reserve banks went into contract with the owners of the gold to make a payment of 4% per annum on the use of the gold, and they did not do it. So to recover on the injury, then we had to create a commercial lien to create a fact in commerce that this had happened. So we're not talking about maybe this happened, but we're using admiralty technology to create a fact in commerce. Now, once the fact is created, that overcomes all fictions, and now we can start to operate in the real world. Now, the lien itself would basically be looked at as an arrest warrant, and that is, we're going to arrest the title to the gold, because the 4% that was totaled up, which had never been paid, come to twice the amount of gold that was originally leased.
Right.
And so demand for that interest, I shouldn't say interest, demand for that 4% fee for the use of the gold is now established as a fact and can be acted upon. And so I'm not going to reveal all the strategy that we're working on to deal with that right now, but that's the reason why we created the commercial lien, was to establish the fact that the 4% was due and owing, and it had not been paid. Now that demonstrates the injury. So as injured party, then the owners of the gold can go and seek redress in the real world and not just sit and quibble about it in some ridiculous court someplace.
What would be the force that they could exact to fulfill this redress?
Well, again, I don't think I'm going to give away all the strategies that Neil and Keith are working with, but certainly you would call in a mercenary. The best mercenary I know is Pentagon. That makes sense to me.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that mirrors my understanding.
Yeah.
I think it's still difficult for people. It's funny because, my God, I have never, ever been hated so much in my life as I have been since I got involved with you guys. It's horrible.
I don't hate you, David. I think you're doing a great job.
No, I know you don't. But this is not easy. We're seeing 20, 30 letters a day of vicious hate. And it's very hard for me emotionally. I got to admit that. Do
you have a button on your computer that says delete on it?
I do.
Any hate mail comes in, to hit that button, delete. Well, we don't operate on hate. We operate on love. The people
I know that.
Hate, we don't talk to them.
I know that. And I know that these mass arrests are very real. I've spoken to multiple insiders about it, and I know that Neil in particular is in contact with a great number of people talking about this.
Yes.
And I know you can vouch for that. People are not able to comprehend that this could be a good thing. They think that, I don't know, there's just so much out there of everybody is working over every little detail. And one of the things that we keep hearing, we're getting tons of hate about this, is why didn't these guys file a lawsuit like they did before? Why isn't this on public record?
The reason why it is because they came to me on this one. They ran the RICO, through a lawsuit, and that's back before I actually was knew Neil. I knew Keith certainly by that time. But
right, and RICO is a government act that basically prevents against racketeering.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But at this point in history, we needed to create a real result. You understand, the United States District Court is a fictional court. So when the RICO was sued and the offer came in for the settlement, it was going. How do you think the settlement was going to be paid? It was going to be paid in book money or ledger money. It's still going to be paid in fiction. So it was a fictional suit in a fictional court, the result of which would have been fictional money. Now, in this case right here, we decided that perhaps we wouldn't want to go the fictional route. We wanted to go the substantive route. So the only way to go that way is to put the thing into substantive commerce. And so we created a substantive lien to deal with the gold and the payment of the 4% fee associated with the lease of the gold. So the judgment, if the thing ever does have to go to judgment, the judgment is going to be in substance and not in fiction. Now, this is an important thing because we're not playing pity pat with this. This is in the real world. This is not in the fictional world.
And you're saying that there are mercenary forces in the Pentagon that can enforce this lien.
Well, the Pentagon is a mercenary.
Right.
And hopefully there'll be good guys. In the past, we've had some controversies with the way the Pentagon did things, but it appears at this point the attitude within the Pentagon, certainly among the senior officials, is that we need to clean this mess up. And I say, God bless them.
Right.
I don't have enough guns and billy clubs to do it myself. I'm too old to even swing one. But they got people that go out and do these kind of things, make arrests and make things right and so forth. So let them do their job. There's some people in the Pentagon that have good hearts, and they want to see the things set right. I mean, there've been good people in there from, according to Drake, way back in the 70s. Actually, I think it goes way back into the 50s if the reports I read are correct, who want to restore constitutional government and give everybody in the country a fair shake. I'm all for that.
Absolutely. I think in any organization, you're going to have people who basically are there to work their job and honorably protect the people and the Constitution. And they want to raise children and grandchildren, and they just want to have a job and a place to live and a decent life. And they're not doing blood drinking rituals, and they're not, it's a very small percentage.
Very small percentage, but that small percentage has had a great deal of influence. And look here, as long as we keep giving credibility to those kind of people, they'll keep on going. If you look in the scripture again, what did Jesus say about, he says, resist evil. He said, get behind me, Satan.
Right.
You see? Because he did not want to deal with that negative all the time standing in front. He said, get out here behind me. I'm not talking to you. I got other important things I'm going to do. Now, for instance, if you look on the television and you see all these, oh my goodness, the perfect example was those Godfather movies where everybody was romanticizing a bunch of crooks, robbers, and murderers. Now, what in the world is up with that? Why do we romanticize somebody who would take a gun and kill somebody for money?
I just saw another example last night. The hottest movie on iTunes right now is called Contraband with Mark Wahlberg. And I thought personally that the structure of the film, I got drawn into the story. It was very believable. But at the end of the movie, basically what happens is, and I'm sorry to give it away, but he gets away with it.
Yeah.
He ends up with a $20 million, he ends up with a $140 million Jackson Pollock painting that he can sell on the black market for $20 million. He ends up with, I think, $2 million for something else that they did. And they successfully pull off this smuggling. They smuggle drugs, they smuggle currency, and they smuggle this Jackson Pollock painting. They get away with it, and it's the so-called happy ending where this guy now has this fabulous oceanfront house, and all these people died, but he got the money, and he's totally fine, and that's supposed to be your happy ending. Yeah, it was crazy.
Yeah, I know. I mean, we have so many of those things, but how can we develop a moral consciousness in this nation as long as we keep romanticizing these kind of things? You can't elevate the spiritual level of people as long as they're giving credibility to the mafia.
Right.
It don't work.
Right.
So we're trying to in our small way, I might add, make our contribution to the efforts that are being made by the many, and this thing that that I worked up with Keith and things we're doing with Neil and stuff like this are only an effort to improve the circumstances on the planet. We're not here to destroy anything. We're here to help improve the things that we already have. Like I told Keith, there's no reason to destroy the Federal Reserve banks. Look at the infrastructure they have. Let's just get the things set on a proper course so that they operate according to their charter, so they do the right thing and stop, creating all these problems. Now, that would be a real good solution to a problem rather than simply, destroying it, taking the bulldozer and pushing it over the building. That don't make any sense.
Well, if you actually read the charter, as I'm sure you know, it sounded great. It sounded like there was going to be worldwide prosperity and peace, and it would create an incredible boon for our civilization. And I think they had to write it that way in order to draw people in so that they would agree to it.
Well, I think maybe that, there may have been some evil intent involved in that. But that's what we're doing right now with some of the other operations we have going on, is simply to free up all of those heritage. There's enough money in the interest on the heritage funds to bring complete prosperity to the whole planet. So we are in the process of liberating those funds for the use of the nations to improve the life, of the people that live there. And so, this is a fairly large operation we're talking about here. We're not just talking about some RICO suit. We're not talking about some lien. We're talking about a major operation to influence the liberation of the funds and the money that has already been created, which has been held back by the banks on their false pretenses, but to release that money for the use of the countries and the nations and so forth to improve the prosperity of the people that live there. So this is it's a fairly overreaching. This is a large operation here, folks. This is not a measly little RICO and a measly little commercial lien. I mean, there are big things that are being worked on here, and a great deal more big things than are being reported.
Right, and to that end, I would say that you have created these liens based on an accurate understanding of this admiralty law system, and they have been filed correctly within the basis of that system, and this all has been done on behalf of an alliance of countries that the Pentagon is assisting in to be able to bring these guys to justice.
Yes, and I'll have to tell you, David, I've probably got 2,000 or 3,000 students that are fully as capable of doing what I just did as myself.
Wow, okay.
We've been using these commercial liens. I've been using them ever since about like 1999. Actually, I learned it from a fellow named Hartford Van Dyke. And he made an improvement on what his father was. His father was using common law liens. Actually, Hartford's father and uncle was at Pearl Harbor. I think his Uncle Max is the one that decoded the Japanese communications. And of course, the government locked him up to shut him up. But anyway, these things have been developed, used, especially commercial liens, have been developed and used successfully, certainly since the early 90s.
Well, yeah, and
it's nothing new.
I understand that, and I have a guy here in L.A., and I haven't done this, but he was describing how you can exonerate debt, you can, pay off things that are not paid by accessing, they call it lassoing your straw man. Yeah,
that's quite a long and technical technology, and sometime when we have a lot more time to speak on that. But that has been the basis of our commercial redemption processes and so forth, utilizing the exemption and using our Treasury Direct as a pass through back to the global debt facility to discharge debts. So that's a pretty broad subject there,
right.
And one which we've I've been lecturing on this now for about 8 years.
Okay, so just to clarify, then, I think people are by now very well aware that this is not something you pulled out of your ass. You've been doing an incredible amount of research, and that research gets results. You are getting
Absolutely.
You are getting these liens to work. It's not some unproven technology.
Oh, no.
It's all legal, but it's legal in a way that most attorneys who are members of the Bar Association, right? And this is where Jordan Maxwell, if he was here, we'd have him chiming in on that. But all this admiralty stuff is written into the very basis of our legal system, and people don't realize that.
Yeah, go back and look at the original Constitution and what did it say about impairing the obligation of contract. It says it can't be done. Now the contracts we're doing the contracts we're doing exist in the Admiralty. That's where we're doing our contracts. We're not contracting in common law. We're contracting in the Admiralty. And so nothing can be done to impair the obligations of those contracts, which is very obvious. That particular commercial lien, that we authored, cannot be impaired, not by any court. We did it on the private side.
Is that why at the very beginning it says this is a certified plain statement of fact? That seems like
Absolutely.
Okay. Why is that there? Why is that such an important statement at the very beginning of the document?
Well, it has to do with the principles the maxims of commerce. Well, somebody wants to study commerce, go look up on the internet maxims of commerce.
Okay.
And it'll explain to you about the use of affidavits and all those kind of things. As a matter of fact, if you look on the first part of that affidavit of obligation, I list probably, 15 or 20 different maxims of commerce on there. See, I established the law of the contract before I even start talking about who the parties are.
Right. Well, I think that to a certain degree, one could argue that in the justice of the jungle, in the justice of the barrel of a gun, he who has the peso has the say-so, and he who has the gun makes the rules. And so these liens wouldn't work at all if it wasn't for the fact that there's somebody who's ready to enforce them.
Actually, no, the liens do work anyway. For instance, when as I mentioned, a lien is an arrest warrant. That is, it arrests the thing. It arrests the title to the thing, so that the thing itself cannot be moved. This is all Admiralty procedure. If you go back in ancient times, when the Admiralty, let's say, for instance, a ship came into port and there was some kind of disagreement, maybe the sailors' wages or bills of lading or something was wrong. And so they would immediately go to the Admiralty with a complaint, and the Admiral would have the marshal go out and tie the ship up to the dock. And it couldn't leave anywhere until the matter was settled. And so then when that was done, then the court would notify the owner of the ship that this had been done. So the owner would have to come into the court with fiduciaries and with sureties to secure the release of the vessel. So this is the exact same thing we're doing with a commercial lien here, is we're creating a certified statement of fact in the form of an arrest warrant. So we're arresting the title. In this instance, we're arresting the title to gold. So the gold can't be moved. It has to stay in port. It's still tied up to the dock and can't move anywhere, which means nobody can use that thing, that ship, that gold, until the matter is resolved. And if the matter is not resolved, then you can go into the levy phase and actually do a seizure on the ship or the gold. Now, we'll probably use the Pentagon as the marshal of the court to go and do that, just like they did back in the Admiralty courts. Or if not the Pentagon, the U.S. Marshals or somebody.
So at some point, does that mean that all of this stuff is going to have to be explained to the public once this all comes into focus and becomes a real action and a real series of arrests? I mean, it seems like what we're talking about seems so extremely complicated, and I feel like all people are getting is little thumbnails of a body of knowledge that you possess that is much more vast than we can cover in one conversation.
Well, let me just plug it right here and now. If they go to my website and look on the product list, they'll see all these subjects that we've talked about here that we've presented in seminars and webinars and all manner of things.
I have no problem with you plugging that. I'd love to see documentation. So,
well, just have them go to WSSIC.com, which stands for Winston Shrout Solutions in Commerce, and look at the things we have there. like I say, I've been doing seminars, DVDs, and all these kind of things for about 8 years now, and we've put out a massive amount of information.
So, okay, WSSIC.com.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Okay. And I'm assuming that some of the things that you have people would pay for to read, and some of the things you have are public and people can just read it on your website without paying for it.
Actually, we haven't published too much on the website itself.
Okay.
As far as information that could be downloaded and so forth. That particular business is not my business. I don't actually run that. That's a support business, and so they have to keep the lights on.
Right.
So that's up to them. But at the very least, what I've tried to do over the years is to at least leave a footprint in the snow, so that if someone wanted to follow along and find out and learn what I have learned, I've at least broken trail for them. And like I mentioned, this whole process is an art form. It's a way of life.
Well, and I've heard,
it's the blue pill or the red pill.
And what I've heard from people who know about all this stuff is that they will play along. If you learn this stuff and you start playing their game, they will give you what you want.
The first time I did a commercial lien, it was against a police officer. And it made a convert out of me.
Wow. What happened?
Well, I think he's still sitting on a desk. See, the problem was that once I went and did that lien, then that they could no longer insure him. They couldn't put him in a patrol car and put him out on the street because they couldn't get an insurance policy on him because they hadn't paid the lien. So as far as I understand, he's still sitting on a desk. And then as I learned later on, as a result of that from other sources, they said that after I did that all the policemen and sheriffs in that area went out and put all their property into trust because they knew I could get it if I wanted to.
Wow.
And one of the things that I got from that more than anything else was I got a whole lot of respect in that area. When I walked into a courtroom and the judge knew who I was, I got a lot better reception than most people generally do. I see the benefit of it. I mean, like I say, I did that first commercial lien. The second commercial lien I did was basically against the officers of a corporation, and they went to the attorney general of that state to see what could be done about it. The attorney general looked at it and said, "Sorry, I can't do anything about that."
Wow.
He knew.
That's heavy. That's a heavy statement.
Yeah, it's heavy. But again, we took those simple principles. A commercial lien for $1.5 million against a police officer, did the same application for 2.5 million metric tons of gold. In for a dime, in for a dollar. It's the same process whether you're dealing here locally or whether you're dealing internationally. It's the same exact process. That's why I said I probably got 2,000 or 3,000 students who studied this stuff that could go do the same thing I just did. It's just that I happened to be the guy on the scene at that time. That's all. There ain't nothing special about me.
How do you think it is that they've been able to keep this so secret from everyone up until now?
Which particular things are you talking about?
I don't know. I mean, we're dealing with a vast subject, and obviously the judges, at some point in their college education, they are learning about all this stuff. They're actually getting all this information. But like you said, there's no book that you can go read that ties this all together.
Well, like I say, I have to say about the education system. When somebody comes to me and says, I got a PhD, or they say, I got a JD, that doesn't tell me what they know. It tells me what they don't know. And I do know what the law schools produce. They produce students who know procedure. They do not study law. They don't study constitutional law. They don't study common law. They don't study admiralty law. They understand procedure. And so that's what attorneys work with. And so when you bring to an attorney something that's substantive, such as a commercial lien, their first reaction is, Hey, that's crazy. That's not legal. It doesn't exist in their world. But their world is different than the world of substance. They operate totally with codes, statutes, and fictions. Now we come in with something in reality, and I can see why they would get excited about it. They say, hey, we can't do that. And no, you can't do that, because obviously an attorney has no civil liabilities anyway, and they don't deal in the real world. And so when they see something like this, it just absolutely sends them into a tizzy, because they can't deal with it. It's just like that attorney general told that guy. He says, I can't do anything about that. He couldn't do anything about it. It was totally on the private side. And so, yeah, well, I mean, you got parallel universes going on here.
When does a judge learn about this? He obviously
he doesn't.
He doesn't.
He doesn't learn about it. You understand, when a guy accepts a job as a judge, first off, he's an attorney. And then they make him into a judge, and they give him a book. Say, here, study this book, and this will tell you how to be a judge. And that's all he knows, unless he goes and does independent study. But he is not taught these things. He has to understand. We've had some interesting things. There are some judges out there that are very well educated, but it's hard to find them.
Well, okay, so I'm a little puzzled right now, because if the attorneys don't know about this, and if the judges don't know about this, who the hell does? And then why?
I do.
Okay, well, you're one dude, but
I give out the information as fast and furious as I can. That's why we're having this little interview.
I understand that, but let's try to wrap our heads around something here.
Okay.
How does it exist if nobody knows that it exists? How does it have any value if no one recognizes its value?
Oh, I guarantee it was recognized.
But how?
They knew what it was. You understand? Let me go back in history. Back in the 30s, back in the 34 and 35, when they created all those bonds on Federal Reserves and all that kind of stuff, don't you know that those bonds were written against a commercial lien?
Ah. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So everything, just because it's new to you today, don't mean that tomorrow or the next day that you can't start to comprehend and put it into your world. I mean, when I first came upon this, I was completely dumbfounded. It took me a long time to sort it out in my mind, because I had to change my logic. And that's a hard thing to do, when you spent 50 years thinking one way, and then all of a sudden you're presented with new facts, new evidence, and so forth, and it takes just a little while to wrap your mind around it, as I say. One of the hardest things I have to do as an educator is to uneducate people.
Right. Do U.S. Marshals know more about this than U.S. judges?
Yep.
They do.
A true U.S. Marshal, I think, would, yeah. You understand the U.S. Marshal Service is actually a private corporation.
I did not know that.
Oh, they're not government. They're not a government agency.
I thought that, because we've had interviews with this man Drake, and I grilled him on where the U.S. Marshals located, and he didn't really answer the question. And then other people came in and said that they were part of the Justice Department.
But Justice Department is a corporation, and it's incorporated in Delaware.
Ah.
Everything's been fictionalized. The United States Incorporated is actually a maritime corporation in Puerto Rico. That's why we got to get rid of them. That's what this whole arrest process is to restore fair elections and good constitutional government and so forth, and get rid of the corporations, get them out of our business. Restore reality to the country.
Okay, well, if the U.S. Marshals do know about all this weird, arcane admiralty law stuff.
Well, I'm not saying that each one of them doesn't, but saying about certainly if they're educated at all. You understand, when I started doing all these seminars and putting out all these DVDs and all that kind of stuff, who do you think my biggest customer was?
No idea.
Think about it.
U.S. Marshals and police?
I would have to suggest. Actually, one time I was called in as a witness before a grand jury, And lo and behold, I looked down, and the U.S. attorney that was asking me questions about this situation over here, he had a copy of one of my seminars, DVDs of one of my seminars, sitting right there on his desk.
Oh my gosh!
Where do you get that from? Everybody needs to learn this stuff, and I don't begrudge anybody that wants to know.
Right.
I mean, I know for a fact that some of the big attorney firms back in the East, was ordering my DVDs simply so they would know how to, I don't know if they're trying to find out some way to confuse it or counter it, but I know. I'll tell you, for instance, when I first met Keith, I met him over in Cambodia on a certain thing that I went to, and he didn't know who I was and didn't know anything about me. But after he met me, he was impressed enough that he started calling around to different international contacts, that he knew. And he asked them, do you know Winston Shrout? And they all come back and said, yeah, we know him.
Wow.
He said, why am I the only guy on the planet that don't know you? I said, well, you know me now.
Wow.
So word gets around. I already had international recognition, long time before I got involved with Keith and this process here. And so what I have done with Keith and Neil and the things they're trying to do is I've simply added what little bit I know to implement the things that they're trying to do. And so far, it's been helpful. And as long as I can keep being a help, I'll keep doing it.
Well, now I am aware of this guy who deals with stock market cycle analysis, and he puts out books, and those books are similar to, and they're derived from material by another guy, and he was selling that material for $10,000, and he was getting
Really?
it. Yeah, he was getting it because of the amount of benefit that people could get out of that technology once they start using it.
Well, it's cost analysis. If you think you can spend $10,000 and make $11,000, that's a good purchase.
Right. My point is that the kind of information that can actually generate large amounts of wealth for people, some people capitalize on that to an extraordinary extreme.
We've had some of those, yeah.
I'm curious to hear what you charge for some of your DVDs based on how much value people could get out of this if they start using this system.
Well, for instance, a typical seminar that I've done in the past usually starts on Friday night and goes through Saturday and Sunday for a total of about 14 hours worth of information, which they reduce down to about 7 or 8 DVDs, along with a CD that has any documents, templates, or anything like that. And most of them go for around like $185 or $90, somewhere in that arena.
Wow. So you're saying that they get all the DVDs, they see the show, and they have all the documents, all the boilerplate that they need to be able to actually go out and put their name on it and enact these liens.
Yes.
And that's less than $200.
In regards to commercial liens, I did a single topic DVD on that, where I went through and described completely the whole history and so forth with commercial liens. And then I provided templates, from several different directions that could be used for different situations. All that went on to one DVD that lasts, I think, about like an hour and a half. And I think that going for, I don't know, $85 or $90 or something like that.
Wow. Look,
people don't realize what it costs to produce these things.
Oh, I know for sure.
Yeah, you know what it costs to produce this stuff. And initial investment is horrendous.
Sure. Well, look, I think that's very reasonable. And I think that you've absolutely demonstrated that you have an incredible background on this. You have a long proven track record. You have tons and tons of documentation that people can access at a fairly reasonable cost. There are some people out there who are in absolute poverty and they can't afford anything.
We've never turned anybody away because they didn't have money.
Wow. Okay.
If you can demonstrate that you don't have anything, we never refuse people like that. What the business manager usually does say, well, if you don't have that price, what could you contribute? Now, the reason behind this is we have found time and time again that if people do not make an investment of some amount, that they won't treasure the thing that they receive.
Right.
And so if somebody says, I don't have $150. You say, well, what do you have? They say, well, they might say, I have $20. Okay, then we'll do it for $20 because we want them to put value in for value received, because that's the only way that they'll treasure what they get.
I understand that. And I would imagine that if they succeed in using your system, that they're going to want to give back anyway when they get to that point.
That's fine. You know, we don't need to have that kind of thing come back to us. What we want more than anything else is for people to have an understanding of it, find out if it's something that they can apply in their life. And if they do imply it, if they're successful with it, God bless them. Go bless somebody else. Well, I've got shoes. I got clothes. I got some place to live, and I got food. So if you receive some benefit from this, go help somebody else with it. Okay.
Regarding, you said that you filed liens and the Attorney General said there's nothing I can do about this.
Yep.
So that's a level where the buck stopped. That's a level where somebody knew enough to know that this really works.
Absolutely.
Where did the Attorney General get that information from? It's not like everybody's running around with a Winston Shrout DVD in their pocket.
Well, probably he looked at the lien itself where it says John Doe 1 through 20.
Okay, why does that matter?
He didn't want to be John Doe number 1.
Ah. But how did he know that you were actually doing something that was enforceable?
Well, the attorneys are very familiar with administrative due process. And so I'm sure when that Attorney General looked at the administrative due process and saw that the process itself was correct and complete, then that's why he said, there's nothing left to be done. You understand that this is prejudicial. It's prejudicial. Now, it could be taken into judicial, but all these private administrative processes we do are prejudicial, and we try to settle it on the private level. Again, going back to the New Testament, what did it say about there in problem resolution? It said, go to your brother first. If you can't settle it that way, go to arbitrators. If you can't settle it, with arbitration, then and only then go to court. And so we're out here trying to resolve these things between our brothers. And if we have to, then we go to arbitration. And then if you think, if worse comes to worse, then you go to court, but only as the last resort.
Well, the Federal Reserve people could basically flip you the middle finger and say, sure, you want to file liens against us, but hey, you're just gonna bounce off our back, and we don't give an F what you do.
Tell it to the Pentagon.
Right.
Winston is a pacifist in that respect. I'm not going to hit somebody on the head with a club over this, but the Pentagon might.
Right. So in other words, these people, this cabal, they created this system. They know this system probably, I imagine that there are guys who know everything that you're saying on the inside, because they created that system, and they can't stop that system from being used against them if someone has the knowledge and if someone has the backing, which in this case would be the Pentagon.
Yep. It's law, merchant law.
Right. It regulates commerce and trade.
It's substantive. It's not fiction. It's all in substance. See, when I was talking to Keith about that situation, because he had the original contract for that gold, for the 4%, I said, Keith, look at that and see how that 4% was to be returned. Was it in money or anything else? And he said, it doesn't specify. I said, well, gold was given, so gold will be returned. So when we wrote that lien, then the return on the 4% was to be paid in gold. is all in substance. So we didn't go into any kind of fiction whatsoever with that.
Well, I think what I'd like to do, Winston, is I think this is like chapter 1, and I'd like to have another chapter. And I think what would be awesome is if we could get you and Jordan Maxwell together and talk about this where both of you can ping pong off of each other, because I would love to have had his input in this discussion, because he's been lecturing on this stuff just like you have. And there's a lot of things that he would toss in quickly that I think would help to add context. So are you open to that in the future?
Yeah, sure. Actually, I was on a seminar with Jordan. He did one day and I did the other. And it was back in, I don't know, about 2001 or 2 down in California. So it was, I met Jordan one time and we shared a podium one time. So yeah, I'm open to it.
Okay, great. Look, I think that people are probably going to be confused. I think it's really important that we get the transcript. I feel like once we established the thoroughness of your knowledge and the fact that you're already out there making this work, I think maybe people are starting to get a sense of this and starting to get a sense that, hey, we're not making this up. The attorneys and the people who are trying to tear these liens apart simply don't understand the legal system that the cabal actually created and is using, and whether they like it or not, and whether they want to or not, this system is now being used against them, and it's being enforced by what I'm calling the good guys, which would be people in the Pentagon who want to see freedom and want to see their children have a world that we can all live in peace and in harmony.
Yeah, that'd be great. And if you get that transcript, maybe you could send it to me so I can go over to make sure that I didn't slip a word or use a wrong word.
I'm sure that our transcribers are not going to understand all the things that you said, and there's probably going to be some little things that need to be clarified. So
yeah, so that'd probably be a good idea.
So this is a process. I'm not entirely sure whether to put it out just as audio first or whether it should come out with the transcript at the same time, because I think people are going to get lost in it. There were some places where you were speaking really fast, and unless you're reading it, you're probably not going to be able to keep up with it fast enough. But nonetheless, I think I probably can put the audio out as long as I give a disclaimer that says you might get really frustrated listening to this, you might get lost, and it may not be something that you really want to try to listen to as much as something you can read where you take your time. And we will try to stock it up with some links and some things people can click on to go back and follow up and do the due diligence. But
sure, I've looked at the things you put up before, David. And you do a masterful job. I got to say, you do a great job. So,
well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And I know you got to bust out the door. You have a personal issue that's urgent, and I want to respect that. So I will end our interview at this time. Do you have any final statements you'd like to make here?
Oh, just, thanks for the effort of all the people that are trying to make the world a better place. My appreciation goes out to you.
Well, I thank you for getting involved and being willing to do this. It's very brave. And I think that one last statement from you about these mass arrests. So many people simply cannot believe that this is going to be done. Do you yourself believe that this actually is going to be done?
Absolutely.
And why?
This has been on the horizon now for a number of years. I think the real factor here is the technology that Drake had developed so that the military could come in and not have to deal with the civil problem. You understand that the military cannot intervene until the civil government has been deposed. And so the technology that Drake had come upon there was facilitated the deposition of the civil government so the military could intervene.
Right.
In the past, we've gone to the military with habeas corpus and various other things, and they would come back almost every time and say, we cannot help you at this time. And we were always in a quandary, wondering what the right time would be. But now it's been demonstrated, through what Drake had developed there, the deposition basically of the civil government, so that the military could intervene without breaching the civil government.
Well, some of the paranoid and angry comments that we get is, "Oh my God, you're trying to overthrow the government." And it's funny because like they realize that we're dealing with a completely criminal enterprise here, but then as soon as anyone tries to oppose it, they don't want it to be touched.
Yeah, well, I think the key to the people would be to go into the United States Constitution and look at the oath that's in Article 2, and then look at the oath in Article 6 and see which one the present president actually took. He only took an oath as a corporate employee. We have never. I mean, if Jordan wants to get into a conversation about conspiracy, we would need to go right back to 1788 and 89 at the Constitutional Convention. Why did they come up with the 14-year requirement instead of 12? I mean, 14 is not a Masonic number. 12 is, 13, so forth. Why did they come up with a 14-year requirement on that first presidency? But you go back and you find out that right from the start, George Washington took the Article 2 oath. We have not had a man who has been qualified or who would take the Article 6 oath as President of the United States of America. So if people want to start on their journey, just go read the Constitution. Go read Article 2 and go read Article 6.
Interesting.
Yeah. All right, well, let's get off onto another subject.
Yeah, well, this has been very fascinating, and I really want to thank you for participating.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. It's been a real pleasure.
I think this is an investigation that's ongoing. I'm going to be interested to see the transcript and start following up on some of this stuff because I am one of those people who want to educate myself.
Great.
So I'm really looking forward to that process, and I thank you for facilitating that for us.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you, Winston. This is David Wilcock, DivineCosmos.com. And Winston, if you could give us your website again.
It's WSSIC.com, which stands for Winston Shrout Solutions in Commerce.
Terrific. Thank you, and till next time, buddy.
Okay.
All right, very good.